Greetings, Taku Faithful. Thank you for joining me again this week. Once again, it's Larry Williams, OAW Commander-in-Chief, and I'm here to bring you all yet again another Arrow episode review right here on Otaku Assemble! Weekly. As always, I'm here to bring you the latest in this week's Arrow episode review. But before I jump into this week's review, I want to go ahead and remind you all that my first comic book, Totems, Issue 1, goes on sale next Wednesday, November 21st, and it will be available on graphically.com, facebook.com, and it will be available for digital download on Kindle, Nook, iPad, and Kobo. So keep an eye out for it. I will be updating you all the way up until the release. Be sure to check it out. Now, with that being said, let's jump into this week's episode review, and this is my review of Season 1, Episode 6, entitled Legacies. So, first and foremost, general thoughts on this week's episode. I liked it a lot, and the biggest reason for that being is that I think, I could be wrong about this, but if memory serves me correctly, I think this is the first episode that we've gotten so far in this season where only two fucking things were happening. And this is what I mean. This week's episode only had two major events, two major storylines occurring, and everybody else's little involvement in this week's episode revolved around those two major events. In a way, this method is very Smallville-ish, because for any of you all who have seen Smallville, or for any fans of that show, you guys know Smallville did this a lot, where in their episodes they'd only have maybe one or two things. Most of the time, especially in the early seasons, those one or two things was usually what Clark was doing in that week's episode and what Lex was doing in that week's episode, and everybody else kind of revolved around whatever those characters were doing. So Arrow decided to go ahead and implement that in this week's episode, and I liked it, and this is the reason why I like it. First off, it's minimalistic. I've noticed that the series does have a problem with providing cohesion in between their multiple storylines and their multiple character arcs. You know, when every character has something different that they're doing in one episode, yeah, Arrow doesn't really... I'm not saying that they're horrible at doing it, but they've had trouble in a few episodes trying to, you know, make that cohesive and make it seem like everything flows together. Now, of course, you know, there are a few exceptions, like last week's episode. There was pretty much one major event and then a few smaller events going on at the same time. But I just feel like this week's episode did such a good job at working and managing all the characters around these two events, which of course were the Royal Flush Gang and the and Tommy's fundraiser. You know, those were the two big things, because everything that Oliver and Diggle were doing revolved around the Royal Flush Gang, and then of course what was going on with Thea, Tommy, Laurel, all that was surrounding the fundraiser. So, like I said, I like the technique because it's minimal. Because it's minimal, you can avoid much confusion. Things don't get murky. Things don't get thrown all over the place, and it really does make everything feel like it belongs. It makes everything feel in place, because the story, what's going on in the episode, it's tight knit. You see what I'm saying? One thing causes another thing causes another. It's all tight knit, and it's cohesive. It works. It meshes together. It blends well. So that's one thing I'll give this week's episode a nod for, is that. Another thing, okay, if anything, I felt like this week's flashbacks, although once again they play a part, because what happened in this week's flashback, it does correlate with what's going on in this week's episode. That is true. However, I felt like this flashback, because of what I mentioned earlier about how this week's episode was so cohesive and everything worked together, the flashback is what was out of place. And I don't mean out of place as in it just didn't belong. No, because like I said, the whole thing about legacy, the themes of legacy, what Robert left to Oliver, and what the parents in the Royal Flush game, what they left to their children, that correlates. That all correlates. But I felt like the flashbacks in this week's episode was weak because it seemed like what we're talking about, Oliver, his internal struggle, pretty much this is Oliver's near-death experience, because he's starving to death, he's starting to hallucinate, he's starting to see the ghost of his dad, all that type of thing. This is his internal struggle. However, his internal struggle is completely, and I'm talking about overwhelmingly, bombarded with guilt and self-loathing. And I am not sure how powerful of a motivator that is. I mean, Oliver is motivated by guilt. Now, don't get me wrong, the guilt, fires the need for redemption, for retribution, that type of thing. But this week's the flashback suggests that Oliver isn't doing it so much to honor his father's memory as he is because he's haunted by his father's memory. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't feel like Oliver needs to make things right because he wants to. It's more so he's doing it because it's his dad's last wish, and he has to do that, to dissolve himself of the guilt of being the one who was left behind. Do you see what I'm saying? Oliver feels guilty because he was the one who made it, and so in order to honor the last wish, that's why he's doing what he's doing. But he doesn't seem to be doing it because he wants to do it. And shit, it's not even so much this whole thing about he's taking it upon himself to kind of clear his family's name, if you will. It doesn't even seem like it's that. Now, like I said, I'm not saying that none of those things apply. I'm saying that the flashback suggests that it's out of guilt. So that's why I felt like the flashback was weak, because it seemed like to kind of be undermining everything else I just mentioned. And I don't think that's what the writers want. I'm just letting them know how they sound and how Oliver sound with that scene, especially the way Robert sounded in that scene. I mean, damn, it's a guilt trip is what it is. And I don't see that being that's a weak motivator to me. That's why I felt like those was weak. What I do like about this episode, though, which I thought was really done really well. First off, Diggle and Oliver's scenes, almost all of them, I loved. Especially that training scene at the beginning. I just thought that was cool. But I like what Diggle is doing, where he is kind of bringing Oliver down to earth. He's letting Oliver know that, hey, you're going after these, high up, the rich and powerful, but the little guys need help too. And Oliver doesn't have an interest in, street level crime, but Diggle's the one who's kind of bringing him over, right? But this is beautiful, and I love it because any of you all who have read Green Arrow in the comics, especially if you've read him in the Justice League, who's the street level guy? Green Arrow is. So I like this idea that this isn't what Oliver is interested in, and this isn't what compels him, this isn't what engages him, right? So now that Diggle is the one trying to sway Oliver, trying to persuade him, to bring him over to see things like this creates Oliver's one of the moments of change for Oliver, where now he will start to value the little guy more, and now he'll start to think about this. think about the street level crime a little bit more. Be a little bit more conscientious about the crime that's going on within the city, rather than the suits in the executive offices. I like that. Not now. Oliver has the position to change that about himself. He has that opportunity. So I thought that was really cool. But that brings me to one of my problems about this week's episode. Now, this could be for the sake of adaptation, because they needed to fall in line with what the theme of this week's episode about, which is legacy. But correct me if I'm wrong. Now, I'm not too familiar with the Royal Flush Gang in the comics. Most of my knowledge about the Royal Flush Gang comes from Justice League and Batman Beyond. But last time I checked, the Royal Flush Gang was kind of aristocrats in the crime world. When you talk about the crime world, they were, these high-end thieves. You see what I'm saying? They weren't street level thieves. They were the high-end guys. They were the thieves that the rich and powerful would hire should they need something stolen for them. You see what I'm saying? And they carried themselves with that sort of pretentious attitude that even though they're still criminals, they're higher than the rest of the criminals because of the things they go after. Like they go after rare artifacts. They go after one-of-a-kind jewelry and museum pieces, high-end shit. They don't bother with banks or, shit like that. They go for the high-end stuff, the classy stuff. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that who the Royal Flush Gang, isn't that their MO? So if that's the case, why would they adapt them as low-level criminals when Oliver's whole thing is the rich and powerful? Well, they would fall right in line with that, don't you think? But like I said, maybe this is a case of adaptation. Maybe they needed this, because in order to fit in with what Diggle was trying to get across to Oliver, and in order to fit in with the whole theme about legacy, maybe they need to change what the Royal Flush Gang was about in order for that to happen. Like I said, I'm not that's the art of adaptation. That's the art of adapting material. You have to adapt it in order for it to properly correlate, into the other medium. So this, if that is in fact the reason why, that makes sense to me. But I would have just liked to see the Royal Flush Gang as they originally, in the cartoons and whatnot. That, to me, it seemed like the Royal Flush Gang from the comics would interest Oliver more than the ones in this episode. That's all I'm saying. But other than that, what else? I'll end this review with this, because I feel like I do need to comment on the whole Tommy, Laura, Thea thing. Let me put it to you like this. I like the thing with Thea and Tommy more than I really cared for the Tommy Laurel thing. You see what I'm saying? Also, another thing though, I gotta give this episode its props, because none of the romantic shit felt forced. None of it. It all felt natural. It all felt realistic. Tommy, his advances at Laurel, that felt realistic. Thea's, her thing with Tommy, that felt realistic. None of this shit was forced. You feel me? Whereas whenever you get the Laurel Oliver shit, it almost always feels forced. And I don't know what to fucking account. I don't know why that is. I don't know why that is. Is it because that's the relationship that's supposed to make it, so it has to be set up in a certain way? Is it because maybe Stephen Amell isn't really that good of a romantic actor? I don't know what it is. All I'm saying is the romance in this fucking episode, hell of a lot better than the previous ones. Really was. It really was. And I like that, you know, they're working Tommy back in. Because, I mean, shit, Tommy's been gone for like, what, 2 episodes, I think? So they're starting to work him back in. Granted, I don't really care much for Tommy's character. I just think he's in the way. But if you give him something to do, if you give him a reason to stay around, I can tolerate I can accept a character like that because he has a purpose. You know, I don't like characters who, you know, who come in between of relationships just because they need to be some added tension there. I don't like that shit. I hate that shit. If the character's gonna be there and gonna, you know, be part of the love triangle, whatever the hell you're trying to set up, give them a reason, give them purpose, give them something other than, oh, I just want that person. You see what I'm saying? Now, granted, they haven't really done that with Tommy yet. But what I'm saying is the way they were able to work him in this episode leads me to believe that they can do some interesting things with him in the future. That's what I mean. So, with that being said, that's wrapping up this week's Arrow review. I want to thank you all for joining me again this week. And in the comments below, let me know your thoughts on this week's episode. Whew! All right. At this point, I can't make any promises about the discussion of the week or the podcast for this weekend because I am going to be busy as hell. I mean, shit, it's already Wednesday and my weekend is pretty much occupied almost entirely. So if I can manage to squeeze those out, I will, but I'm not making any promises at this point because I got a lot of shit to do. Sorry, it's just the way that works. This is what happens when you try to run a fucking business during your final semester of college. The shit gets crazy. So, anyway, but that's going to do it for me. This has been Larry Williams, OAW Commander-in-Chief. I'm signing off, and until next time, peace.